Tonight, we begin with a military operation that American officials have long feared, consistently underestimated, and silently hoped would remain hypothetical. I'm talking about an operation that forced Vladimir Putin into an urgent midnight meeting with his top military leadership. What happened has fundamentally changed the strategic landscape. Ukraine carried out an operation that defense planners had modeled dozens of times in war games, but never expected to witness. This wasn't improvised. This was methodical and devastatingly effective. Preparation went back months. It was so secretive under tight operational security that even Allied intelligence could only pick up snippets. For 18 months, Ukrainian doctrine followed predictable patterns. Defensive operations predominated. Strategic objectives remained within defined boundaries. But 7 days ago, something changed. Intelligence monitoring stations recorded anomalies that didn't fit established Ukrainian behavior. Long-range assault units moved to launch sites near Odessa. Electronic warfare battalions moved into forward deployment. Elite special operations units withdrew from Donbass without being replaced by new troops. Secure communication channels were completely cut off. Western analysts recognized these signs from previous large-scale operations, but this time the scale was different. Coordination was tighter. Security was virtually impenetrable. With forces operating in this manner, they were preparing for offensive operations requiring absolute surprise. Given the redeployment patterns identified by intelligence, only one conclusion remained. Ukraine was preparing attack something significant that would provoke a major international reaction. In the early morning hours, space-based infrared detection systems registered what analysts characterized as multiple high-speed thermal signatures launched from Ukrainian-controlled areas. These included at least 7 weapon systems that hadn't been operationally used for more than 2 years. These represented a category of capabilities Ukraine had preserved only for moments when it wanted to deliver a clear and unmistakable message. We have abandoned our restraint. We have ceased respecting your so-called red lines. We are hitting assets that you have declared were off limit. Pentagon analysts weren't completely certain which category this operation belonged to, or if it covered all 3 aims simultaneously. The only thing they knew for sure was that Ukraine had fundamentally altered its escalation approach. And when Ukraine changes its escalation posture, even marginally without advance warning, the United States instantly notices it. The statement issued by the White House this evening was far from routine. It was not ceremonial. It was not simply procedural. It contained urgency that officials rarely display in public communications. Senior administration officials emerging from an emergency situation room meeting described Ukraine's strikes as sovereign, precise, and perhaps most importantly, irreversible. That final word carries enormous weight in diplomatic terminology. Irreversible means there is no walking this back. There is no diplomatic off-ramp being offered. There is no face-saving exit being prepared. The deterrence works only when the targeted party shows hesitation. Putin showed none. In fact, his reaction this evening ranks among the most alarmed responses we have seen throughout this entire war. Here is what the evidence reveals. Within 4 hours of confirmed initial strikes, Putin convened an emergency consultation with Shogi Gerasimov, the chief of the General Staff and the commanding officers of the Aerospace Forces and the Black Sea Fleet. These were not the regularly scheduled security briefings that occur every Tuesday and Friday morning in the Kremlin. These were not the routine status updates that military leadership provides to the presidential administration. These were the emergency meetings you call when you understand that your threats have been made obsolete, when the fundamental assumptions underpinning your entire strategic posture have just been invalidated in front of the world. United States intelligence agencies confirmed that Ukraine launched a coordinated deep penetration strike operation against 4 separate target categories inside Russian sovereign territory, including the Engels 2 strategic bomber facility that had been recently reinforced specifically to counter this exact threat. This was not a facility chosen at random. Engels 2 represents the cornerstone of Russia's strategic nuclear triad, houses the aircraft that carry Russia's most devastating conventional and nuclear cruise missiles. It is the physical embodiment of Russian nuclear deterrence. And Ukraine struck it direct. Ukraine struck before Russia could disperse the pair of Tu-95s and the pair of Tu-160s stationed there. They damaged the primary runway at Engels, making it temporarily unusable for heavy bomber operation. They compromised the hardened aircraft shelters that were supposed to protect those strategic bombers from precisely this kind of attack. They destroyed the ammunition storage facility that intelligence indicates was actively preparing to reload nuclear-capable cruise missiles onto those aircraft. The timing of the ammunition depot strike is particularly significant because it suggests Ukraine had detailed intelligence about operational cycles at the base. They knew when the munitions would be most vulnerable. They knew when the protective measures would be at their weakest. They exploited that window with precision. In other words, Ukraine deliberately targeted the exact infrastructure that allows Russian strategic aviation to remain operational. This factor explains why Washington's statement carried such weight and urgency. Ukraine's operation was not simply symbolic in nature. It was not designed merely to send a message or to demonstrate capability. It represented an existential challenge to Russian military power. It showed the kind of operational capability that could effectively neutralize Russian strategic air power if executed at scale repeatedly over time. And Moscow, understanding this reality fully and completely, responded not with displays of strength, not with immediate military retaliation, but with urgent crisis management. And here the narrative takes an even more remarkable turn. Intelligence officials assess that Ukraine's recent deep strike operation was specifically designed to test the real credibility of Russia's Sun deterrence after 3.5 years of empty escalation warning. Kiev wanted empirical proof that Moscow would actually follow through on the catastrophic consequences it had repeatedly threatened. Every time Western nations provided Ukraine with more capable weapon systems, Russia threatened nuclear response. Every time Ukraine struck deeper into Russian-held territory, Russia warned of inevitable escalation. And every single time, nothing happened beyond rhetoric. Instead, the opposite occurred. Russia did not launch hypersonic missiles at Kiev. It did not move tactical nuclear weapons to forward positions. It held an emergency meeting and went silent. So deeply silent that even the most aggressively pro-Kremlin military bloggers are tonight expressing visible outrage and humiliation. These are not Western analysts making these observations. Attracting Moscow's attention requires operations that strike at the psychological foundations of Russian strategic thinking. Ukraine achieved this with a precision that left the Russians struggling to understand how their defenses failed. NATO officials describe this as a turning point that redefines what Ukraine can achieve independently. The operational complexity represents a quantum leap. Multiple attack packages from different vectors were directed at targets within minutes. This synchronization requires an advanced infrastructure that most analysts didn't believe Ukraine possessed. The second waves exploited the chaos from the initial attacks with such precision that Russian air defenses had no countermeasure. Each wave targeted the vulnerabilities created by the previous wave, demonstrating real-time adaptation typically associated with top-tier military capabilities. The 3083rd Drone Regiment carried out the Engels assaults with a textbook precision. They were launched from locations that the Russian early warning system classified as low-priority threats. Approach vectors exploited radar coverage gaps that shouldn't have existed in Engels. The timing of the strikes disrupted damage control. The first wave disabled power. The second wave targeted fuel. The third wave struck bunkers while defenses were operating with low reserve power. Naval forces from Odessa struck Krasnodar early warning facilities which Russia had relocated 6 weeks earlier to avoid target. Ukraine located these facilities through intelligence gathering efforts, and NATO experts raised clear questions about this. Partisan networks with extensive preparations destroyed the railway infrastructure supporting logistics. Ukraine is no longer defending territory. It is systematically weakening Russia's power projection in multiple areas. This represents a fundamental shift from reactive defense to proactive battlefield reshaping. Strategic reshaping remains the sole objective that Putin has consistently tried to prevent since February 20th. From the very beginning of this conflict, Putin's strategy has been built on one fundamental assumption that he could control the pace, scope, and geography of this war. That assumption has now been shattered. Remember how Putin calculated that Ukraine would collapse within 3 days? He genuinely believed that Ukrainian resistance would evaporate to the moment Russian forces crossed the border. He assumed NATO would fracture from within 3 months, torn apart by economic pressures and political division. He also believed that his nuclear threats would paralyze Western decision-making processes indefinitely, creating a zone of strategic paralysis that would prevent meaningful support for Ukraine. But tonight, the exact opposite scenario is playing out in real time before our eyes. Ukraine is displaying greater military capacity than at any previous point in this war, not less. NATO is showing more cohesion and unity than at any point since the end of the Cold War, not fragmentation. And Russia's nuclear threats have been completely exposed as hollow rhetoric, devoid of substance or credibility. What makes this particular moment both explosive and dangerously fragile is that Ukraine's attack comes at a time when Putin's 24-year authoritarian rule is facing the heaviest domestic political pressure he has encountered since coming to power. The military establishment is demanding a decisive escalation to restore credibility after repeated humiliations on the battlefield. They want permission to use Russia's most devastating conventional weapons. They want authorization to strike deep into NATO territory. They want vindication after years of promises that victory was just around the corner. The security services are advocating for de-escalation to protect their institutional assets and power bases from further degradation. They recognize that continued escalation threatens the very structures that keep them in power. The oligarch class desperately wants a negotiated ceasefire to save what remains of their accumulated wealth, which has been systematically destroyed by sanctions and asset seizure. They have lost billions. They want the bleeding to stop. The propaganda apparatus is demanding absolute victory at all costs to maintain narrative control over the Russian population. They cannot acknowledge weakness. They cannot admit failure. They must construct a reality where Russia remains powerful and triumphant. Putin, while attempting to balance these fundamentally contradictory demands from competing power centers, is also watching his strategic air force being rendered ineffective by a country he has publicly declared non-existent as a legitimate nation. And when leaders operating under such immense pressure make sudden strategic moves, these decisions don't stem from positions of power or confidence. They are decisions born purely of terror and desperation, which makes them extremely dangerous and unpredictable. Washington's statement represents far more than a diplomatic positioning. The language used carries weight, which experts consider a significant policy shift. When White House officials describe Ukraine's actions as the natural exercise of sovereignty rather than provocations leading to escalation, they are fundamentally reshaping the United States' perspective on this conflict. For months, American policy operated within a framework of security measures designed to support Ukraine, while avoiding direct confrontation with Russia. These even included implicit restrictions on how Western weapons could be used, particularly in the case of attacks on Russian territory. But this statement doesn't explicitly remove those restrictions, nor does it explicitly reaffirm them. This omission speaks volumes. Zelensky's televised address was delivered in a tone that Western officials found remarkable. There was no air of triumph, just a calm presentation of facts and a clear strategic position. He reminded listeners that justice is not limited by geography, that threats have temporal limitations, and that Ukraine's goal is to end aggression. These talking points were set to signal determination without recklessness. What particularly caught analysts' attention was their realization that Engels was not alone. This was a component of a coordinated multi-field campaign spanning 12 hours. While bombers targeted Engels, partisan cells derailed trains in Bryansk. While the trains were derailed, cyber warfare disabled Russian military communications. While communications were cut off, Ukrainian fighters conducted aggressive reconnaissance near the Kerch Bridge. Each element was timed for maximum confusion and minimum opportunity for Russian reaction. This coordination demonstrates what Western institutions find disturbing. Ukraine developed command capabilities that operated without real-time Western intelligence support. Ukraine established far more extensive intelligence networks within Russia than anticipated. Ukraine made strategic escalation decisions independently of Western advice. This third point keeps officials awake at night. If Ukraine can conduct operations of this magnitude without Western approval, what else can it do without consultation? Multiple strategic interpretations are being discussed in classified assessments. One framework suggests Ukraine is preparing for spring offensive operations, requiring the neutralization of Russian air power. An alternative framework suggests a deliberate provocation to trigger an overreaction justifying Western military intervention. A third, most worrying framework suggests Ukraine has concluded that the only way to end this war is to systematically weaken Russian operations, rendering them unsustainable. Each has quite different conclusions. If large-scale offensives are being prepared, expect additional attacks against Russian logistics. If a provocation is being attempted, expect increasingly bold operations that corner Moscow. If a weakening strategy is being pursued, prepare for sustained deep strike operations that gradually eliminate Russian power projection. The United States Strategic Command has implemented continuous monitoring of Russian nuclear forces. Early warning satellites provide constant coverage. Signal intelligence is capturing all communications for indications of nuclear weapons movement. All intelligence confirms there has been no increase in the nuclear alert level. There is no tactical arms movement toward forward deployment. There is no change in the submarine deployment pattern. There is no increase in security around strategic weapons facilities. Putin's decision to hold urgent consultations instead of authorizing immediate retaliation reflects desperate attempts to identify response options to prevent an uncontrollable escalation while avoiding the exposure of vulnerability. But the critical factor that is changing all the dynamics is this: Ukraine is not waiting for Russia's negotiations. They are systematically accelerating the operational tempo. New attacks, sabotage operations, and cyber attacks are taking place every day. The message is clear and unambiguous. Geography provides no protection. Russian threats carry no weight. Operations in Ukraine will continue until strategic objectives are achieved. What unfolds in the next 48 to 72 hours will depend almost entirely on Putin's decision-making and the actions he authorizes. If he lashes out with disproportionate retaliation, this moment will be remembered as the spark of a wider regional war. If he does essentially nothing beyond rhetoric, Ukraine has demonstrated they are capable of finishing this conflict on their own terms. Tonight, for the first time since this long-running war, Vladimir Putin truly appears cornered with limited options. The Kremlin remains silent, disturbingly silent. And when the Kremlin exhibits this quality of silence, it indicates they are frantically calculating, reconsidering their position, and realizing something they never wanted to acknowledge. Their red lines have evaporated. Their threats lack substance, and their war just came home to Russian territory. For months, Western officials operated under a framework of escalation management. The concern was never whether Ukraine could strike deep into Russia. The concern was what Putin would do in response. Would he use tactical nuclear weapons? Would he attack NATO supply lines? These fears created a ceiling on what Ukraine was permitted to do with Western-supplied weapons. But today, Ukraine demonstrated something Washington has been reluctant to acknowledge. This ceiling was always artificial. It was maintained not by Russia's capabilities, but formally by the West's concerns. And the moment Ukraine decided to break this ceiling, it disappeared. What we are witnessing now is the result of that breakthrough. Russia did not resort to nuclear weapons. It did not attack NATO. It held a meeting and fell silent. Tonight, we are left with profound questions. Will Russia retaliate in ways never seen before? Will a cornered Putin make decisions that will take this conflict beyond Ukraine's borders? Will the West finally provide Ukraine with all the capabilities it has demanded for years? These are unanswered questions for now, but the evidence suggests that answers will come soon. Stay tuned for updates.